the real deal, as you will clearly see. My friend, Eliot Coleman.
Thank you, Russ. Very often I get asked why someone seemingly intelligent with a good education somehow diverged from the path he normally would have been expected to take to end up in this game. And it's because basically two things. I love adventure and I love to eat. And years ago, I used to spend my time doing every imaginable adventure sport. In fact, I just had my left knee replaced because I destroyed it in a downhill ski race disaster in Chile 60 years ago, and it finally came back to haunt me. But we would challenge everything that was there to be challenged. I never did anything this stupid, but this is somebody in a kayak going over a 100-foot waterfall. And this is someone in a kayak going off over a 180-foot waterfall. This is the don't do this at home, kids, but nothing is impossible. I also spent an inordinate amount of time rock climbing. And this is El Cap in Yosemite. And I've never climbed there, but it was a famous climb, and the first guys to climb it. It took 4 of them about 30 days to get up at sleeping on the cliff, and finally it was climbed in a week, and it was climbed in a day. This is the guy who set the present record of 2 hours and 35 minutes. Nothing is impossible. So that was the background that I had been involved in when I first heard about small farming. And I'd heard simultaneously that it was impossible, I love the word impossible, to farm and grow food without using chemicals or pesticides. And I thought, okay, that's where I want to go next. Well, the land I started on was all wooded. It was covered with spruce and fir trees. I got it at a very inexpensive price. And I thought, okay, this makes the adventure even better. We have to get rid of the trees, we have to roll out the rocks, and then we realized that there was only 2 inches of topsoil, it's very sandy, and so then we have to make the soil fertile, and so we really had an adventure ahead of us. The trees on this land were all spruce and fir, and they were about 4-5 inches in diameter. It had been logged off a number of years before. And we learned a couple of tricks because we had no power tools. I had a saw and an axe, and we would cut the trees off about 3 feet above the ground. And then I had a root axe, and I would chop around the roots of them, and then we could get the stumps out. And for some reason, a reporter from the Wall Street Journal heard that there was this supposedly intelligent human being carving a farm out of the Maine wilderness and making a success of it, and he showed up one day. And he showed up while I was chopping around the roots of these stumps. And what we had learned was the fir trees did not have a taproot. If we chopped their surface roots, we could just almost get them out like this. The spruce trees did have a taproot, and it took a lot more work. So I chopped all these stumps, and then I went over to the fir tree stump, and I rolled it over. The reporter happened to be standing next to a spruce, and Wall Street Journal reporters do not necessarily know the difference in bark between a spruce and a fir. Out of the corner of my eye, I could see him going like this. And when the article came out in the Wall Street Journal, he wrote about Eliot Coleman ripping stumps from the ground with his bare hands. The morning that came out in the journal, I happened to be down at our farm stand. We opened at 10, and this car came squealing into the parking lot, and this woman, sort of like a Wagnerian opera singer, came striding in, and I thought, oh my God, she thinks she has just read about the Paul Bunyan of her dreams. And she came up to me, at the stand. She said, "I want to meet Eliot Coleman, the man who pulls stumps with his bare hands." And so I straightened myself up to my full 5'8", looked her in the eye, and I said, "I'm Eliot Coleman." It's my fondest hope that at the end of my presentation today, I do not see on any of your faces that same look of abject disappointment that I saw on hers. So anyway, what you see in the picture there is now the cleared land of the farm, but it's surrounded by the forest that we had to get rid of in order to have the farm, and it now looks like this. The forest has been put back, crops are growing, because if you put your mind to it, nothing is impossible. And we grow an amazing selection of produce. We are 3 miles from a paved road. Part of the way to us is a gravel road. And yet we have more business than we know what to do with, because people recognize good food when they get to taste it, and they come all the way. Why does it work? Not because of him. He's just determined. It works because of what he's holding. Compost. It should be illegal that the world's best fertilizer can be made for free in your backyard from plant waste products. But that's exactly what's going on. This is the same material that has fertilized the forests of the world for millions of years. The leaves fall to the ground, they rot into humus, and that is what stimulates growth. It can be made very simply. We make as much compost as we can possibly make. I have a neighbor who bales hay. If his hay gets rained on, he will bring me the rained-on bales, and I'll pay him baling costs, and we use them as walls for the compost heap. The dark material you see in there is seaweed from the coast, one of the advantages of living on a peninsula on the main coast. And there are other ingredients in there from the coast. The island just south of us, Deer Isle, there are a number of very hardworking women, wives of lobstermen. In the lobster traps, there are always a lot of unwanted crabs, but they've learned the husbands bring these in. Their wives have wonderful business picking meat out of crabs. And I can get crab shells, which are probably the best fertilizer you can imagine for vegetables. They are a magical, have magical properties, and we put them and other locally available resources, spoiled hay. Most of the old farms around us have been bought up as summer homes. They're no longer being farmed. They pay a local contractor to come in and mow the fields to keep the farm look. And I'm smart enough to convince these people that leaving that hay drying on the field next to their house is very dangerous, because if it caught on fire, it would burn their house down. So they hire me to come and collect it, bring it home, and compost it. Anyway, there's resources for making compost everywhere. We mechanize it slightly from the old days when I turned things by hand. We put it through a little manure spreader to turn it. But basically, it grows almost anything you want to grow. There is a lot of research being done today in agricultural schools on what's called induced resistance. And induced resistance is if you have the soil in good shape, if it's providing everything the plant needs, there are microorganisms in the soil that induce resistance in the plants against pests and diseases. The soil microbiome is the most amazing new concept of research, because the plant can actually, by giving nutrients off of its roots, determine the population balance of the microorganisms living around its roots, and can encourage those that it instinctively knows are beneficial to it. This is so mind-blowing when you realize that there are things like that going on, have been going on forever, that we as human beings never paid attention to in the past, because it seemed to make much more sense to just go in there and throw some chemicals on and throw some pesticides on to make everything work. So we have fields of beautiful vegetables. We use no pesticides at all, not because we object to them, but we do. It seems foolish to poison people. It's interesting that before Rachel Carson wrote her book and made DDT unpopular, the most used pesticide in the country back then was something called lead arsenate. It was a combination of lead and arsenic. Now you have to wonder what species is silly enough to purposefully spread lead and arsenic on the food that it's eating. So this, I mean, the history of that is beyond belief. So why would anyone even think of using pesticides if you can grow beautiful produce like this? The French breakfast radishes are my absolute favorite. Or the cucumbers in this greenhouse. We set out a new planting of them every 3 weeks, and there's always fresh cucumbers. You grow them vertically like that. It's just really amazing how much space you can save. When the vine reaches the top of the string, we've let a single stem go up, we let a second stem come off, and then the vines trail back down to the ground, producing cucumbers at every node all the way. It's beautiful to see, incredibly productive, and the cucumbers are awesome. In order to grow as much as possible, we have grown in low tunnels, like the one you see in the background there, and in greenhouses, because we are, as Russ said, on the 44th parallel, and our winters are long, and we sort of like to be able to extend the season in both directions, earlier in the spring and later in the fall. We started out with these low tunnels, and what's supporting that fabric on there, and that fabric is wonderful, it lets air, light, and moisture pass. This became popular with vegetable growers back in the 60s. What they found was what was going into the disposable diapers was a fabric that, if you bought it in large rolls, let air, light, and moisture pass and would provide you a simple little low greenhouse like that. We bend those pipes to make it look like that. But okay, serious winter comes. This is good in March, April to get you through early spring, on maybe to November to get you through the fall. But in serious winter, we want serious greenhouses. So this is the way our farm looks in the winter. And back to nothing is impossible. Well, yeah, you can grow all year in a greenhouse if you put a lot of heat in there. Well, golly, what if you don't put any heat in? I wonder what happens. And what happens is, yes, you won't be growing many tomatoes or peppers or eggplants, but there are some wonderfully delicious, very hardy crops that you can grow all winter long in there by putting a second layer, that same fabric you saw, about a foot above the ground in the greenhouse. And we stumbled over this because we love trying new things. But basically, you have two layers there. You have the layer of the greenhouse and you have the layer of the fabric. Each layer basically moves the covered area 500 miles to the south. So outside the greenhouse, I'm in Maine. I walk into the greenhouse, I'm 500 miles to the south in New Jersey, which, as I always say, is a place you only want to go metaphorically. And when I reach my hand under the inner, I was born and grew up there, I'm allowed to say that. When I reach my hand under that inner layer, my hand is in Georgia. And so the winter climate under there is the same you would have outdoors in Georgia, where there's all sorts of crops like spinach and Swiss chard and Asian greens. And the one in the picture there is a delightful California weed. It's one of the few Californians we allow on the farm, called Claytonia. It was a weed in the mountains of California that the gold miners ate. And it used to be called miner's lettuce. And so there are a lot of crops that can stand the cold and that we can harvest all winter. It isn't all peaches and cream, because it snows in the winter and there's a lot of work clearing the south side of the greenhouse off so the sun can get in. But other than that, it's a great success. But we wanted more, because the greenhouses all summer long in our cold climate are being used to grow the cucumbers you saw, peppers, eggplants, and tomatoes. And I purposely pronounce them tomatoes because when they're grown on a good, fertile soil, the flavor is such that when you eat it, you say, ah. So it's a tomato. But how do we get the winter crops in if the greenhouses are filled with summer crops up to the time when everything freezes? Well, we said, what if we moved the greenhouse? So this is our first experimental movable greenhouse. A couple of neighbors are helping me. It sits on posts with a ball-bearing caster in the top, and there's a channel on the bottom of the greenhouse so we can just slide it across there. So it's spent the summer growing summer crops. Those carrots there had been planted at the right time, and now we're covering them so we can harvest them all winter. And it is the most successful system we've ever seen. This is a much bigger house. This is a 30-foot by 100-foot house. And that's me in the background there on my little tractor pulling this down the field over the crops that it is going to spend the winter protecting. You can see this part of the farm from the local highway, and there are always cars screeching to a halt. There's something the size of a large barn moving slowly down the field, pulled by the tractor. It slowly gets the end and covers everything. You notice that the bottom of that end wall has been folded up. They fold down. We put the door back in, and all of a sudden we have a greenhouse again. This used the posts with the ball caster on top system. We decided we wanted something better than that. So we did a couple of experimental houses where we actually attached a wheel to the bottom of each hoop and laid a pipe on the ground beneath it, and the wheels rolled on that pipe. These are the same wheels and pipe you will see on gates into industrial parks where the gate slides sideways. It was easy to find this technology. But we wanted something that moved even easier because we were using winches to move some of these if we couldn't get the tractor in there. And so we found a system of really good wheels with good ball bearings that could be moved easily. And so we designed a greenhouse for a company out in Kansas City that is now the Cadillac of movable greenhouses. And this one moved easily enough with those wheels and the ball bearings that two of us could just push it down the track. By being the Cadillac of movable greenhouses, it was more expensive than most small farmers could afford. So, since nothing is impossible, we decided, okay, we can come up with another way to move the greenhouse. And if you see that, in order to roll down the track, it has to sit just above the ground, and therefore you have to seam up that gap when it's in place, and you have to unseam it before you move it. And we thought, okay, let's go back to a greenhouse that sits right on the ground, and rather than towing it like a sled, let's make it easy to move. And I spent a whole winter wearing out pens and sheets of paper to come up with what I called the lift wheel. And the greenhouse sits flat on the ground. At 5 places along its side, there is a 3/4 inch hole. And this has a stem that goes into that hole, and if I push down on that handle and lock it in place, the wheel then lifts the greenhouse just a couple of inches off the ground, and it can then be moved 5 on each side as far as you want to move it. The nice thing about this is that These are the same wheels that now move every greenhouse on the farm. After you move it, you take them off, store them away, nothing bad happens to them. And this has really been an amazingly useful system. As you can imagine, if I can move a greenhouse, the wind can move a greenhouse. And on a windy day, the idea of something the size of a large barn wafting toward you on a stiff breeze is an unnerving thought. So when the greenhouses are in place, we have them thoroughly locked down to 4,000-pound ground anchors. And then we obviously unanchor them when we move them and anchor them again when they're in place. As with any adventure where you're doing things that no one has done before, there are occasional glitches. And there have been times when we didn't quite anchor the greenhouse enough. And it ended up wrapped around the power pole on the edge of the field. But the nice thing about this is we can celebrate our successes and smile about our defeats. Then there are other impossibilities, because when you're growing food artisanally, and I refer to this sort of production as artisanal production, there's a lot of handwork. And there are other artisanal producers still around in the world. Your hand-thrown potters, that's a lot of personal work. Certainly it's a lot better than what's being turned out by Tupperware. And your hand weavers, certainly nicer stuff than you can get from Burlington Mills. But it's a lot of handwork. So there's a lot of handwork in artisanal food. We had to figure out if we could make it easier to do. This is the tool we used to use to mix compost and alfalfa meal or whatever simple soil additive we were using. But it was the least popular job on the farm. Everybody suddenly had a more important thing to do. It was known as the human rototiller, and everybody disliked it. So I imagined a tool that would do this, and I found a man in Maine who was an engineer. He was actually an out-of-work robotics engineer. And I said, I have a project for you. Would you like to go into business making a cool tool? He said, sure. So what we came up with is what's now known as the tilther. And this is a wonderful little tool. Since it's electric, you can use it in the greenhouse. There's no fumes to smell. And we designed it so it's basically like a tractor tiller. That rectangular box on the left side there has a chain and gears in it, and it powers the tines which are underneath that whole thing. And the flange on the back keeps this from ever going more than 2 inches deep in the soil. Shallow tillage is good, but there was another reason for that. If you study weed science, you will learn that weed seeds that are more than 2 inches down don't germinate, because they know they will never make it to the surface and light before they run out of energy. So if you don't bring up seeds from down below, all of those seeds are going to rest there forever. And the beauty about the tilther is that it's powered by something everybody has in their shop, the cordless drill. And being highly technological, we just ran a rope around the trigger, and the rope runs up the handlebars, and you pull the rope, and it turns the shaft, which turns the gear wheel, which turns the chain, and turns the tines underneath. And this is probably my favorite of all the tools we've messed with, because it is so useful in a greenhouse, and you can use it without worrying about asphyxiating yourself. So we're growing a lot of crops in close rows. This picture was taken in the middle of the winter. That's actually snow along the edges of the greenhouse you see there. And then we had to figure out, okay, how are we going to get these close rows planted? Because the closer we can plant, the more efficiently we're using the expensive covered space of a greenhouse, the better. And I'm a funny tourist. I've been in Europe many, many times visiting small farms and learning a great deal from my European friends. But in my spare time, I don't go to museums. I go to hardware stores. And it's amazing what you can find if you like hardware stores. And in a trip to a European hardware store, I found this delightful little tool made by a German company. And it puts in 4 rows of seeds. You see that shaft along there has different size holes in it, and you push the shaft side to side to get the right size hole under the hoppers. The seeds don't come up quite that quickly. This is just a posed picture. But this is putting in rows that are 2 1/4 inches apart, and we now have 12 rows on a 30-inch wide bed. And I was describing what we do on our farm at a farm conference down in Pennsylvania years ago, and everybody there was a 20-acre farmer, and they said, "How do you make a living on a couple of acres?" And I said, "Well, how many rows, say, of carrots do you guys get on a 30-inch bed?" And they said, 3. And I said, "Well, we get 12. So you can multiply my 1 acre by 4. I now have 4 acres. And I said, "How many crops a year are you getting?" And they said 1. And I said, "Well, getting 2 and sometimes 3. So, you know, I have a lot more acres than you might imagine." This tool, you have to take 3 passes down a 30-inch bed to plant all 12 rows, and we wanted to make it more efficient. So I went back to my retired robotics engineer, and we created this, which puts in 6 rows, smooths the soil in front, smooths the soil behind, and you're left with this beautiful, flat, perfect area for the seeds to come up in. And so what I was telling the Pennsylvania growers, here are carrots growing 12 rows on a 30-inch bed. This is highly productive. We can use a lot less land. But wait a minute, Eliot. How do you do that? How do you get in there and cultivate those carrots? Well, there's more miracles out there. If you think about the impossible, there's always a way. We do it with what's called pre-emergence flame weeding. And this is a small gadget we created ourselves. I'm standing behind that to the right. I have a propane tank on my back. The propane is going down that flame rod there. And you prepare the bed a week before you plant it. You plant it, and carrots take 7 days before they come up. So after 6 days, you come along, pre-emergence, and flame off all the weeds that have germinated in the first week and the second week, and your carrots come up into this beautiful weed-free seed bed, and if you've got your timing right, it remains like that. So these are all wonderful little games in order to have a product like that. We plant these almost year-round, and in the fall, this is probably we will do it this year around the 21st of August. Pretty late, Eliot. Yep. We plant a whole greenhouse area without the greenhouse on it. It's growing tomatoes at that point. 2 carrots, 12 rows to the bed. And once the tomatoes freeze out, we slide a greenhouse over the carrots. If you leave your carrots stored in the ground with their roots attached, they know enough to protect themselves against the cold by changing some of their starch to sugar. Sugar is a great antifreeze. You can use it in your car if you wanted to. And they become so sweet that these are known in our local market as candy carrots. Mothers in the towns nearby have told us that our carrots are the trading item of choice in local grade school lunchboxes. If you have our carrots, you can get that kid's Tootsie Roll if you're foolish enough to want to trade your carrot for a Tootsie Roll. And they are truly the sweetest carrots imaginable. There are a few other tricks. The in the summer before we plant these late planted carrots, that field is growing a mixture of peas and oats, which seem to do marvelous things, preparing the soil as a green manure for the carrots. But this is, our Four Season Farm t-shirt has carrots on it because it is our most popular crop. And then we have salads. Everybody today is into baby leaf salads. These are available in every supermarket, shipped, unfortunately, from California and sitting in that little package for probably 10 days before you get to eat it. So that's why all the chefs and customers love the fact that we're there. But how do you harvest those things? Well, the companies in California that are doing that commercially have huge cutters that will cut a 5-foot bed with a bandsaw blade, and it falls onto a belt that's going up and filling crates, and the crates are being loaded onto the truck. How do you compete, as we did when we started, against that? With a knife. Because everybody who was doing baby leaf lettuce, this was one of the impossibles. How can you compete with these people? Well, this is, again, one of my favorite stories. A family came to visit from Tennessee. They had read my book and they wanted to see our farm. And they had with them their 16-year-old son, who immediately impressed me because at the age of 16 in Tennessee, he had his own lawnmower repair business. So I said, oh, okay, this is a smart boy with a good mind. And he was fascinated by all the tools we design. And he asked me the perfect question. He said, what have you failed at? And I said, come on in here, let me show you the pile of things where we've tried something that hasn't worked. And I said, the thing we've been after is to come up with a way to harvest these baby leaves more efficiently than with a knife. And I said, we've used a cordless drill to run a cutter bar, but the problem is, if the crop is a little light, no matter how sharp you make the blade, it'll tend to push over some of the leaves and they won't get picked up. So he said, oh, okay, I'd like to solve that. And I said, please, go and be fruitful. And I showed him all of our failures. 2 years later, I get a phone call from him, and he said, Eliot, me and my dad are coming up to show you what we've come up with. This is great. I love this story. And what he'd come up with was this tool. And pretty much what we had done, we had that blade down the bottom, powered by the cordless drill and a collector behind it. What he had come up with is that reel of macrame cords on the front, which there's a cable going to it from the drill power that makes it spin in front, and it's pushing the leaves back into the container as they are cut, and doing it gently, doesn't harm them. And this was just, it was like one of those things, wow, isn't that just sort of the light bulb up there? So he now has his own business down in Tennessee making these. It's called Farmer's Friend, and he sells a bunch of other things also. And this was like the lifesaver of the time, because we were selling an awful lot of a baby leaf salad that looked like this, that had all the numerous ingredients in it. The hand cutting of them was what made it, slightly uneconomical, so that had been solved. We also wanted to grow other hardy crops, and one of them that obviously appeals to anybody who knows how cold hardy they are is leeks. We wanted to sell leeks all winter. If you've seen the way leeks are usually grown commercially, they're in rows quite a distance apart, so you can go between them with a tractor and hiller and hill soil up against the stems of them to get that nice white base of the leek by blanching it. And obviously, at that space apart, it wasn't going to work to slide a greenhouse over them, and we had to do better than that. And I asked my friends in Europe if they had any secrets for leeks, and they said they did. They said, we poke a 9-inch deep hole into the ground, and we drop a 10-inch leek seedling into it. And once that's done, you can't imagine this is going to work. There's only an inch of that sticking out the top. But now we could plant them close enough on the bed, and that greenhouse has been growing summer crops all summer. It's set up, the leeks have been planted. We can now cover 6 beds of leeks, enough to make it worth using the greenhouse to protect leeks over winter. And the eventual product is looking pretty darn good because you have that 9 inches of blanched shank on the bottom. Somehow, that little inch you saw sticking out, they keep growing out. Their roots are way down in there. This has been one of the other delightful nothing is impossible scenarios that we've investigated. The first tool you saw doing that was expensive to have made, and I love finding simpler ways of doing it. So I went into the plumbing department at Home Depot, and I found I could bolt together all of these things with pipe from the plumbing department, hammer the end flat on the bottom of that. And the reason you want that spatula tip on the bottom is when you poke it in, you twist it side to side, and that flattens out the bottom of the hole, so when you drop in the leek seedling, the roots are flat on the bottom, not held up in the air. And that was the secret to success. And so I try and get farmers to go make their own rather than buying them. But there were other crops we wanted to grow. We wanted to grow the impossible crops. How can you grow a biennial that isn't hardy enough to make it through our winter, so it won't be alive the next year? But it was one of my favorite crops to eat, and we figured, okay, there's got to be a way to do this because we want to be growing artichokes. We are now Maine's largest artichoke grower. When we started experimenting with this years ago, once we figured out how to do it, our crop comes in from the 21st of July to early September, and this happens to be the low period for California artichokes. It's either too hot or too dry. And so we could just imagine getting a huge semi and write Maine artichokes on it in large letters and ship them out there to get even. How did we do this? It's an old technique where you create an artificial spring. It's called vernalization, and you trick the plant into thinking it's older than it is. So we plant the artichoke seeds in the middle of February in a warm greenhouse. 6 weeks later, 1st of April, nice little plants, they happen to think their first 6 weeks in the warm greenhouse is their first summer. So at that point, we move them to a place that's going to keep them cold but not frozen for the next 6 weeks, an unheated greenhouse that we vent very thoroughly. And they think the next 6 weeks of their life was their first winter. So now they're 12 weeks old, and what artichokes do in their second year is make artichokes. You put these in the ground, and by the 21st of July, the artichokes start coming up. We will be getting up to 12 artichokes per plant. And the caption on this picture says, "Eat your heart out, California," because I love that song. Anything they can do, we can do better. Anyway, we have shown that we can grow these things, and they're absolutely delicious. And to have those in Maine. But we wanted other things early because the people who have the free climate given to them by Mother Nature have a great advantage. But what if we pre-sprouted our potatoes to get them to be a month into sprouting and starting to grow? And if we planted them in the middle of March in one of our unheated greenhouses under that inner layer, it usually won't freeze under the inner layer after that, and planted them 2 rows to the bed, as you can see on the left there. That's more Claytonia on the right. So we're getting a pretty good yield. And we could then found that we could harvest baby new potatoes on the 10th of May every year. Well, baby new potatoes, one of the great foods of all time. Serve them with parsley and butter, and there's nothing better. So this was, wow, okay, we'd taken over another California crop. We had a chef asking if we couldn't put some watercress into a stream so he could get watercress. Well, we don't have a stream, but we played around with planting watercress seeds directly in the greenhouse and putting those little misters above them. The misters put out 1 gallon an hour. And I've always thought the watercress thought the light filtering through the plastic was like the light filtering through the water where they normally grow. And we were then in the watercress business, and we had no concerns about whether the stream had been polluted because this was being irrigated with water from our tested well, and it was another spectacular success. And then there's trying to stay in business at this game. Chard is very popular with certain people, but boy, it is a hard sell for other people, even though it grows well. And so we did what we've done with other crops. We decided to find a new way to sell it and give it a new name. And so we started harvesting Swiss chard when the leaves are about the size of our hand. They're very tender then, with no stem, and we renamed it butter chard. If you've ever dealt with restaurants, there's nothing they like so much as putting the name of the crop on the menu. And within 2 weeks of introducing this, every one of our restaurants had a butter chard salad on the menu. So again, many of the skills that wouldn't lead one into farming in the first place is very useful because you need to do some marketing. So we sell a lot to stores and restaurants, but we had just read that 50%, I think it was 50%, maybe only 25% of the volume in your local landfill is food packaging wastes. So we just said, okay, let's solve that one too. I took some cedar logs that I cut on my property to a neighbor's sawmill and had cedar boards cut in half-inch size. And we made all these boxes, and we branded into the end wall seasonal salads. And you'll notice there's some small turnips there, small carrots. Those are going to a chef who requested exactly the size he wanted, and we obviously charged them more for that. But now these showed up in every store in the area that we were selling to. And also, we sell them at our farm stand. Finally, the quantity, Barbara made the gardens in front of the farm stand. She's really good at this perennial garden stuff. I can't even identify the things there. But finally, we were selling, really, perennial flower gardens take far more skill than anything a vegetable grower does. I wander out in her perennial flower garden, and there's stuff coming into bloom all summer long in time. There's two colors growing next to each other, and they don't clash, because, I mean, my God, the things you have to figure out, growing vegetables is easy. And so we're now growing a lot more that we can't fit everything into those boxes. So the secret that vegetable growers have learned everywhere is that you go to the bulb houses that are bringing in Dutch bulbs. They come in these wonderful black plastic crates that last forever. Once the bulb house has unloaded the bulbs out of there, they have no use for them, and it's not worth sending them back to Holland. So every vegetable farm I know is harvesting and presenting stuff in old bulb trays like that. And why do we do all of this? Because we like to feed people. And the whole intent of organic agriculture is to grow the most nutritious possible food to feed people. And this has been proven time and again. If you read some of Michael Pollan's books, like what's the one, Omnivore's Dilemma, he mentions in there studies that were done out in California showing that the nutritional quality coming from organic farms is truly superior, proved by scientific background. And the taste is the other thing. Why do all the chefs want to buy organic stuff? These guys have great taste buds. They've tasted it. They know what tastes best. If it tastes best, it's put together correctly. There's one last impossible that I've been working on for many years. And I've made headway on it, but I don't quite have it down perfectly yet. But I'm trying. My daughter and I faked that in late December. There was black ice on the pond. Overnight, there was a rainstorm. And it was solid black ice. And I said, we're going to go fake a picture. So that's the last impossibility to overcome. But so anyway, what else is going on? What about Nantucket? The town I live in Maine, is 1/2 the size of Nantucket. Nantucket is about 100 square miles. Brooksville, Maine is 50 square miles. And I dug up from the Maine Board of Agriculture their annual report from 1863, how much food was being grown in Brooksville, Maine. And I thought this was significant because we have some very sandy soil like you do here. And 10,000 bushels of potatoes were produced in Brooksville, Maine in 1863. 1,500 bushels of turnips, probably not the most popular food, but there were equal numbers of bushels of carrots, beets, beans, apples, 3,000 bushels of barley, 600 bushels of oats. There were 385 cows on those 50 square miles, 138 steers, 140 oxen, 1,750 sheep, and they produced in 1863 3,600 pounds of butter, which happens to be one of my favorite foods, so I think I would have been happy back then. But it would be curious, I can leave this here with someone, if there is a record in the Nantucket Society, Historical Society, of what might have been produced on the island here in 1863, because there was nothing being shipped in. The little cottage we're living in, thanks to Susan, is we can see the trucks come in on the ferry, and yeah, that wasn't happening back then, so they had to be growing their own food. And I just wanted to do a final explanation of what organic farming is all about, because one of the problems is the press defines it by what we don't do. We don't use pesticides and we don't use chemicals. That's a pretty poor definition for anything. I'm quite sure, some religion, it was only defined by what it doesn't do, would not explain coherently to people the wonderful things it does believe in. So, what we create with all that compost is what I call a biologically active fertile soil. It's all the small creatures in there that are making it work, and that's why no one has ever paid attention, because you can't see these. This is a bacterial action that is liberating nutrients for plants and allowing plants to exploit that to protect themselves against their pests. And pest-free plants and animals are a byproduct of growing food in a biologically active fertile soil. So it isn't that we object to pesticides and chemicals. You don't need them if you create that soil. Now, if it was difficult to do, maybe, but remember, compost is made for free in your backyard from plant waste products. And the rest of organic agriculture, the way we practice it, are old-time techniques like green manures. You grow clover, and it's taking nitrogen out of the air, fertilizing. You till that under, you grow crops. You've grown your fertility in place. Crop rotations. It has been stated that a good crop rotation is worth 75% of everything else you do, which is why the monoculture that's practiced so extensively in large-scale agriculture is failing. If you grow a crop rotation, there are actually fascinating studies. University of Rhode Island did 60 years of studies on the influence of the preceding crop on the next crop, and showed that if this followed that, you had a much better yield than if this followed something else. I mean, just neat stuff. Cover crops. We sow things like oats in the fall to protect the soil over winter. We use oats rather than rye. Everybody thinks that you're going to put rye in the fall to protect the soil. The trouble is rye survives the winter and is a real difficult thing to get rid of in the spring when you're trying to create a garden again. Oats protect the soil just as well, and they winter kill. So you can just rake off the residue. Grazing livestock. Every year we put half of our good vegetable land into a grass legume pasture, and we graze our laying hens on it. And our laying hens live in little movable houses known as a chickshaw. It looks like a rickshaw for chickens. We love cute names. And these houses have a mesh bottom, and we move them across this field. Every night their manure falls to the ground. We move it to a new space. And livestock are really a vital part of the farm and soil fertility, because what we are doing with the chickens and that pasture is an old-time English technique that was known as ley farming, L-E-Y or L-E-A. It's an old Anglo-Saxon word meaning temporary pasture. And so what farmers years ago found out, that if you had animals grazing a pasture, let's say for 4 years, if you then tilled that pasture up, between the roots of the grasses, the roots of the legumes, and the manure deposited by the animals, you practically had virgin soil again. And you could get 4 free years of crops off the nutrition that you had stored in there during the 4 pasture years. And this was known as alternate husbandry. The field would alternate between creating fertility in the grass pasture grazing years and exploiting the fertility in the crop years. And the important thing about this, what organic farming is showing you can do, all of these things I have mentioned are management practices. They are not inputs. You don't need inputs if you're using intelligent management practices. What's the benefit of a management practice? It's free. If you're in there, it's coming out of your head. It's just moving this there. You have to put anything in, and management practices can't run out. Whatever input you're depending upon, that can run out, that cannot be here, especially out on an island. It can't get here. The management practices of organic farming. So, if we want to feed the world in perpetuity with exceptional food, the system exists, and it is far more elegant than it is presented by the press, who only focuses on the don't do this, don't do that. It is probably the most elegant system I have ever worked with, and has satisfied my adventurer's mind for the 50-some years I've been doing this. And I tell people the benefit of this is that this mountain doesn't have a top. If you're climbing a mountain, the dullest part of it is standing on top. Oh, okay. The fun part, the challenging part, we're trying to figure out how to get there. And this has been 50 years of trying to figure out how to get there. Thank you very much.